Good morning, good afternoon, everyone. Welcome to the London School of Economics lecture, BRI versus B3W, a competing vision for Africa. In 2021, the G7 launched a unified vision for infrastructure development across the large developing world as a component of its grand strategy to compete with China's Belt and Road Initiative. And it has been a few months since the B3W was launched. We would like to understand the competing global visions and its impacts to the developing world, particularly in Africa. So allow me to introduce today's great lineup of speakers. We have Danny Russell, Anzetsa Wer, Professor Jibril Fall, and Ovigbi Igwegu. And so first of all, we are very honored to have Mr. Daniel Russell, Vice President of International Security and Diplomacy at the Asia Society Policy Institute, former Assistant Secretary of State for East Asian and Pacific Affairs during the Obama administration, who played a pivotal role in the Obama-era's grand strategy of pivot to Asia. And during his 33-year diplomatic career in the United States, he received numerous awards, among which the most recent one is the 2017 Presidential Rank Award. Danny, may I invite you to deliver the opening remark, please?
Absolutely. Thanks so much, Shirley, for including me in this very distinguished panel. I am definitely not an expert on Africa or on development per se, so I'm looking forward to learning a lot from the other speakers. On BRI, I often describe it as a kind of Rorschach test, especially for people in the West, because perceptions of Belt and Road usually say a lot more about somebody's view of China than about the initiative itself. There's a lot of fear-mongering, a lot of denunciation of BRI as some kind of sinister plot for world domination that is not rooted in fact. That said, 9+ years into Belt and Road, and as we get further and further into the lifespan of many of the projects, unfortunately, there's an abundance of evidence documenting the problem side of the BRI ledger. And researchers who look at projects, routinely report finding corruption or poor planning, unworkable business models, heavy debt, environmental damage, human trafficking, adverse impacts on local communities, insufficient use of local labor, local procurement. At first blush, the Belt and Road Initiative looks like it's gigantic, and that the Build Back Better World, or BW3, is merely aspirational. And there's something to that, but I think before you actually contrast BRI and B3W, you can put both initiatives in perspective in relation to ODA, Official Development Assistance, because BRI projects are not development aid per se, but official Chinese statistics don't give a breakdown like those in OECD countries do. So we don't have precise numbers, but even if you count the subsidized loans that supported BRI projects, even if you count them as ODA, I think a reasonable estimate that I've seen is that China allocates somewhere in the neighborhood of about $3.3 billion per year in foreign aid to Africa. But by way of contrast, the US provides about $10.7 billion per year in bilateral ODA to sub-Saharan Africa. And the collective ODA from the EU countries totals something like $21.7 billion in 2019. So I think the starting point for the B3W initiative is that it comes on top of a mountain of Western ODA, at least 10 times greater than the assistance that China provides. Moreover, Western development strategies are generally coordinated among donors, whereas Chinese ODA and BRI projects are not. I'd also note that something on the order of 95% of China's overseas projects are financed by loans instead of grants, like most Western projects are, and with steep rates of interest, with short repayment timelines, with heavy collateralization of things like mineral rights. On B3W, I make 5 points. One, some of the political motivation in Washington for this initiative is clearly a response to BRI, although it's not apples to apples, one-to-one competition. Second, the B3W is built on top of a number of US initiatives over the last few years, including the BUILD Act, the Development Finance Corporation, the Blue Dot Network, the Clean Alliance, that sort of thing. Third, that B3W is meant to complement the EU's Global Gateway Connectivity Strategy, the UK's Clean Green Initiative, Japan's Partnership for Quality Infrastructure, and of course, the G7 Agenda for Global Action, as you mentioned. Its 4 areas of focus are climate, health, digital technology, and gender equality. The 4 key features, as I would describe them, of the B3W include, first, harnessing development finance institutions in the United States, things like AID, DFC, MCC, a lot of acronyms, and use them as catalysts for mobilizing private sector investment, private sector know-how. Second, close engagement with the recipient countries in order to assess their needs and to maintain that close engagement throughout the project lifecycle. Third is high standards for things like project transparency or environmental and labor protection, anti-corruption, social safeguard, ensuring long-term benefits for the recipient communities. And fourth is its worldwide scope, focusing on low and on middle income countries across multiple regions. So in comparing B3W and BRI, I would stress that while B3W is clearly intended to compete with BRI, it's not structured to resemble BRI. In other words, it's not replicating BRI, it's contrasting with BRI. I think one of the great weaknesses of the Belt and Road, as I've found in my work, has been its inability to attract commercial banks and private investors, largely because the projects aren't adequately de-risked or because they're not structured according to international standards. And that's been a source of great frustration, I know, to Chinese officials. So the B3W's approach to infrastructure development, by the approach of trying to catalyze private capital and private know-how, could be very impactful. It could be a useful model, including for BRI. But that said, BRI exists. It's here and now. It's operating. It's tangible. Whereas B3W is still theoretical. It's nascent. No funding has actually been allocated. It was only announced last June, as you said, and since then there have been listening tours. BRI, on the other hand, is supported directly by state-sponsored financing and loans and a kind of implicit project insurance. It's implemented by large state-owned enterprises and private Chinese companies that have to be very attentive, very responsive to Beijing's political priorities, whereas B3W seeks to mobilize, private capital, private companies, and in the US, in the West, the government doesn't have direct control over them. Chinese construction companies are very fast, they're very capable, they're experienced, they have access to these large pools of trained Chinese labor. China, I observe, cultivates power holders in other developing countries. It presents package deal projects with backloaded financing arrangements that look great and ultra short timelines for construction that also look great, but that are often made possible by skipping the kind of careful due diligence, the environmental, social impact assessments, and so on that are needed. And as a result, in practice, the affordability and the returns on investment in BRI projects seem to have been exaggerated in most cases, and a lot of the money just disappears. Whereas B3W emphasizes consultation, positive outcomes for communities and for local stakeholders. And the flip side of that is that that requires very time-consuming processes and project preparation. Also, BRI projects are strictly bilateral. B3W is deliberately a multilateral approach. BRI's focus is on physical and digital infrastructure, but B3W's emphasis is on, as I said, gender equality, those sorts of things that are kind of human infrastructure. Now, Chinese Foreign Minister Wang Yi recently said that China could consider coordinating with B3W and again repeated the call for the United States to join BRI. And on paper, it would seem like there are some natural points of complementarity between the two initiatives. But you know, as a former diplomat, I just say that practice and politics point in the other direction. That for one thing, China's rhetoric about green BRI, clean BRI, those things, those promises haven't been translated into reality. And very negative views towards the other country in both capitals mean that the politics are a kind of headwind against cooperation. So what I'd say, Shirley, is this is a great forum to explore the implications for African development of both B3W and BRI. I'm very, very interested in what the other speakers may suggest. I think one question is the degree to which African nations can constructively leverage the US-China geopolitical rivalry and the B3W, BRI projects to exercise their own agency in all these development initiatives. And another question is the extent to which this allows African nations to diversify project funding sources and to obtain more project planning and more design capacity. Specifically, I think B3W ought to be a vehicle to help increase access to Western project planning and de-risking expertise, and not only access to financing on more favorable terms. But I will say, just as a caution, that we need to remember that Africa is only one of several focus areas for the B3W. So, you know, competition with other regions perhaps put some limits on Africa's leverage. But I'll stop there and hear what others have to say. Thank you. Sorry, I'm not hearing you, Shirley.
Thank you very much, Danny. That was Danny Russell, Vice President of Asia Society Policy Institute. And next, let's have Anzetsa War. Anzetsa is a development economist based in Kenya, Africa. Her areas of expertise include financial sector and the financial systems in Africa, the digital economy, and the climate finance. Lots of the thorny topics that Danny has just brought to light on. So let's hear what you have to say, Anzetsa, please.
Thank you. Thank you very much, Shirley. Thank you very much, Daniel Russell, for your comments. And thank you, the LSC, for giving me an opportunity to give an African view on this topic. I think, first of all, the importance setting the stage is that there are African economic development priorities, particularly in the context of COVID. And so I'm going to highlight those in terms of their relevance, particularly to BRI and B3W, because sometimes there tends to be a view that Africa can be acted upon either by BRI or B3W, but actually we have our own agendas and we have our own priorities that we're dealing with. I think the most pertinent for this conversation, given the scale of ambition that B3W has and also the scale of financing that BRI has deployed in Africa, is the fiscal stress and the debt servicing reality. I think if you're looking at African governments, right now there is a balance between trying to ensure and maintain fiscal health, while at the same time trying to fund economic recovery. It's not an easy problem. And so the types of policies that you would need to fund economic recovery, like big spends on infrastructure that are prudently and well managed, are quite a tension with the reality of fiscal stress and maintaining a sustainable fiscal path. And that will be a reality that any funder, obviously, that is interacting with Africa with very aggressive lending intentions will obviously have to deal with. I think the other big reality is the digital economy and digitalization, and the role that COVID has had in catalyzing digitalization in Africa. And also just to bear in mind that the African private sector is extremely dynamic in this space and was able to anchor in record amounts of tech-related investment, particularly from Europe and North America, specifically in this space. So there is a lot of dynamism there. And it's will be interesting to see the extent to which B3W interfaces with that, but it must be said that the BRI, the digital build of the Chinese state in African undersea and terrestrial cable has been instrumental in that. And I think that is an acknowledgement that anyone who sits in the African ICT space is really quite aware of. I think the other third thing that we need to think about is the climate resilience and the energy security question. I mean, I'll start with the energy security question because if you're talking about priority infrastructure in the view of African governments, energy security is a big one and building out energy infrastructure. And I think this is really important in how it interfaces with the climate question, because I think there is a view emerging in African capitals that this push to divest away, particularly from gas, fossil fuels journey, but particularly from gas is premature and puts Africa's energy security at risk, right? Yet, energy poverty is a key element of this Africanization of poverty that we've seen, I think, over the past few decades. So I think there needs to be a sensitivity that there is a view that there is a need for transition arrangements, not only to allow Africa to catch up and build out the energy infrastructure that we need and we want, but also to be sensitive to the reality that there are key anchor African economies that derive substantial revenue from fossil fuels. So they need to be given time to reconfigure their revenue generation streams. So I think there has been a sense of a bit of insensitivity to the African reality, whether it's an energy security reality or revenue generation reality, which will then impact the ability to service any new lines of credit, either from B3W or the ongoing from BRI. I think on the climate resilience question, I think this is not one that should be underestimated. And I think particularly as B3W has this as a focus, I think there is a need to appreciate that climate resilience is the priority for Africa. If you look at the millions of African livelihoods, the welfare, sizable chunks of African GDP currently sit in sectors that are directly being impacted by climate change. So that's agriculture, water, tourism, which is very natural asset dependent in Africa. People come to see our beaches and our animals, fisheries and aquaculture and forestry, right? So at the moment, we're already dealing with an attrition in the ability of Africans to earn a dignified income because climate change is already beginning to impede the ability of those sectors to be productive, right? But at the same time, I think there is a need to tap into the view that Africa does not want to pollute its way to prosperity, as you know, of course, richer countries have. There is a view that we can be and we must be the continent that shows the world that it's possible to develop in a green and sustainable and inclusive way. So I think you'll find this push for climate resilience and climate responsibilities is quite real. I think if you're just looking at the B3W and BRI specifically, I'll just again center Africa's infrastructure deficit and our priorities. First of all, if you look at the scale of our deficit, the African Development Bank estimates that the continent's infrastructure deficit and financing needs is at around 170 billion. That's our financing need, 170 billion a year by 2025, and that there's a gap of about 100 billion a year, right? If you look at the priority sectors that African governments are always expressing, this is what we want to be supported in. It's energy, transport, water, continuing to build out the digital infrastructure. But increasingly, we're seeing cities and urbanization are becoming increasingly important as an infrastructure build priority for African governments. One, because of the demographic bulge or the demographic dividend, but also because of the rate of urbanization. Africa has been urbanizing at a very rapid rate. So we need schools, clinics, hospitals, water power generation, housing, communication and transport, waste management systems, right? So these are the real priorities from an infrastructure. And the interesting thing with BRI that I think people that are not maybe from an African view is that the excess capacity that China had in those sectors, in the infrastructure build sectors, actually aligned quite well with the deficits that we had as an African continent. And that's why that synergy emerged over time, where the excess capital and capacity that China was bringing, even before BRI, because they were doing these builds before BRI, that synced quite well. And that's why you've seen this continued partnership in terms of, I have questions on whether that capacity exists in the B3W states, And the reason why excess capacity is important is because you need to be able to update your own capabilities and then direct some of that capacity to other parts of the world. And there are real questions given the sort of need for rehabilitation and infrastructure in certain parts of North America and Europe, do they really have the excess capacity to direct the scale of ambition that Africa really is ready to absorb? So for me, that's a bit of an equation that I haven't been able to figure out. Now, if you're looking at the vision, we're all about digitally connected, climate smart, resilient, climate resilient infrastructure, and the Alliance for Green Infrastructure in Africa was just launched last month with the African Development Bank, the African Union, NEPAD. So I think there's a real sense of where we want to go with our digital builds that obviously BRI has to be more sensitive to, and I think B3W can really tap into. So if you're looking at from an African view, the real differences that we're seeing, and I'm very glad that His Excellency Daniel Russell was able to express his view and shed some more light on what B3W is. But I think if you're looking at it from a track record point of view, obviously BRI has a track record, and we're not really clear the specifics of what B3W will be. And therefore, there's a sense of how do we prepare for something that we're not really clear on? I think obviously the driving force is in BRI has been the Chinese states, and obviously B3W to be more private sector. But I think from a complexity point of view, BRI has been driven by one government with multiple institutions. And I think, as was alluded to, B3W will be multiple governments with multiple institutions. So we have real questions on where will the coordination points sit, and what will that mean for project lifetimes and project completion? How will that work on a practical level from Africa? I'm really glad to hear that there is coordination with EU's Global Gateway, because I think from an African point of view, they do come across as a bit independent to each other. You've got the EU pushing the Global Gateway, which is about 150 billion planned for Africa alone. You've got the B3W, you've got the UK government. They do tend to come across as not necessarily coordinated. So that coordination, I think, would be really welcome. But I think the nuts of the matter will be the value for money and the complexity of builds. If you look at the fact that China has been building African infrastructure for about 20 years now, right? Which means that from a practical point of view, a lot of the easy builds, a lot of the high impact builds, a lot of the priority builds that African governments wanted to be done had either been done, or if they weren't done, you need to ask why weren't they done? So there's really going to be an upping in the game on the level of complexity and sophistication required, I think, in infrastructure development, particularly if you're interfacing deeply with the urbanization trends. And I'll just give you an example where, the China, right now in Kenya, the China Road and Bridge Corporation is building the Nairobi Expressway. It's only 27 kilometers of road, but the government is like, this is the most sophisticated infrastructure project we've ever done. Why? One, it's building an expressway above a regional road artery. And traffic is still flowing, humans are still moving, everything is still continuing. There'll be no accidents, no mishaps in a very dense, built-up urban area that is basically the center of the central business district of Nairobi. It's an incredibly complex build. And I think that should be recognized. Those are the sorts of requests that now, I think African governments will be making. But I think the other side of that is that the fiscal pressure that the African governments are facing will make it very difficult for them to continue taking on very large credit lines that are sort of either envisioned in B3W, the Global Gateway, but also that we've seen through the BRI. So the question that we're seeing is that as an economist, we have a debt sustainability issue that we are all very aware of and we're trying to manage. So where will these new aggressive credit lines sit? How do they interface with that reality, and how will they be managed? Because I think one of the biggest criticisms BRI has gotten is that it's saddled Africa with debt. This is not entirely true. Sovereign bonds and Euro bonds have also played a very big role there. But now we're getting more debt in the context of fiscal pressure. This is a unique dynamic for B3W. BRI didn't have this problem when it was starting out. And I think the other thing is the multiple points of value that African governments are expecting. And I think, again, I'll just sort of give the Nairobi Expressway as a case study. First, it's that it's being built on the public-private partnership model. So that deals with fiscal issues. Because I think African governments are sort of tired of infrastructure being a revenue leak, and they want that infrastructure to start generating revenue. So the PPP model, I think you're going to see a lot more of that in the infrastructure builds. I think the second is just with the political sensationalization element. It's the first expressway in East Africa. It's a game changer. But I think the most important thing is that the Kenyan government and other African governments think that Chinese contractors are able to take on this level of complexity, and therefore they're able to up what they're expecting in infrastructure projects. So it's really not clear what the case will be with B3W in whatever they're doing. And it will be really good to get a sense on the type of capabilities the anchor private sector companies and contractors have, so that we understand and get a sense of what they're actually able to do, not just in external economies, but also their experience on the continent. So I'll just close with 3 issues to consider. I think first, in terms of the BRI, B3W, the fundamental question is, what is the offer for Africa? Infrastructure development has become a nexus of great power competition. You've seen B3W, you've seen the Global Gateway, you've seen the UK government. And there is a concern that are Africans' infrastructure priorities being centered, or are we again just being seen as a pawn in a much larger game that doesn't really center our priorities or our needs? Just to be clear, we already went through this with the Cold War. So there's a real sensitivity to that on the continent that I think needs to be appreciated. I think the other thing is that language and framing matters. We do hear that this, Africa needs to be de-risked. We always hear, certainly I do, that there are no bankable projects in Africa. African governments feeling that they're being lectured on governance and corruption. And to be perfectly frank, not only does that come across as hypocritical a bit, but it does come across as ideologically imperialistic, because you must recall that a lot of this language does emerge from a heritage of colonialism and imperialism. Yeah. And colonialism and imperialism were premised on the dehumanization and the infantilization of Africa. So if you look at things like the debt trap narrative, which is a very live, narrative for Africa, that is premised on infantilizing African governments and making it look like they need to be told how to run their countries. And it's a real tension. And so I think that language and framing really matters, because it does signal the intellectual style that's being brought to this initiative. And it does signal information, I think, to African capitals. And so I'll just finally close with just the need to update capabilities. And I think this is the point about project bankability or risk, et cetera. Sometimes the question is it that a continent of 1 billion people need to be de-risked? Or is it that the tools and the capabilities are out of date, they're not fit for purpose, they're old-fashioned, they're not really interfacing with the new dynamic Africa, our new capabilities? So is it really fair to ask Africa to keep conforming to a very old-fashioned way of doing things? Or is there an opportunity to leverage these new capabilities in the African private sector, in African civil society, and translate this sizable investor appetite to actual projects? So I think the 2 questions I think I would like to leave those who are watching is, will the B3W by default end up choosing simple projects because they think that's what Africa can manage, and therefore by default leave the more sophisticated, ambitious builds to BRI? But the real question is, will African governments really feel that B3W has a requisite experience to build out the complex and sophisticated visions that they have, particularly in the infrastructure space? So I think those are some of the questions. I had others in mind, but I think I'll stop speaking, that I think are really front and center for us on the continent. Thank you.
Fantastic. Thank you so much. And that's a word. Lots of compelling questions and really action plans called for. Let's hear Professor Jibril Fall, our very own professor at the Firoz Lalji Institute for Africa at the London School of Economics. And Professor Fall also leads a variety of projects that are heavily involved in Africa's economic transition and the sustainable development. Professor Fall, please.
Thank you so much, Shirley, and greetings to colleagues and the audience all over. The topic is competing visions for Africa, either the Belt and Roads Initiative initiated by China in 2013 versus the Build Back Better World started by the G7 in 2021. I propose that neither constitute a vision for Africa. At best, they constitute an option that Africa can capitalize on, each one of them having its own strengths, weaknesses, opportunities, and threats. If you want to take the African countries as a group, the vision that they have and have signed up to is neither BRI or B3W, it is Agenda 2063. So the dates, in my view, that are relevant in this discussion is not China 2013 or G7 2021, The relevant dates are 1961, 1966, and 2015. Why 1961? This was the year that a group of presidents of independent African countries met in Monrovia, Liberia, and set up what became known as the Monrovia Group. And in that meeting, they started what ended up leading to two charters that are instrumental to African development. The first charter led to the formation of the Organization of African Union, and the second charter led to the formation of the African Development Bank. And to this day, the African Development Bank is the key infrastructure and financing development institution in Africa. 1966 is because that was the date that the important African Development Bank started operations. And now it is an institution that invests heavily in infrastructure and other programs in Africa, capitalized at over $200 billion. Now, 50 years after the formation of the African Organization of African Union, which became the African Union, and 50 years after the signing of the African Development Bank Agreement, which was in August of 1963, the African heads of states called for Agenda 2063. That was in May of 2013. And by 2015, you have Agenda 63, Agenda 2063. And aspiration one of Agenda 2063 says, and I quote, "A prosperous Africa based on inclusive growth and sustainable development." And if you look at the 7 goals under that aspirations, they cover all of the big things that BRI and B3W are talking about. So for Africa, with these initiatives as options, possible options, potential options, rather than a vision, offer the mix that's needed. Africa and what it needs is it's a mix of the hard infrastructure and amenities, as well as the softer services and accessories that are needed as a mix for development. And in relation to the nature of the financing, be it ODA, be it softer loans, be it FDI type investments, African development need all of the above. But of course, there are some finances better than others. But the literature so far has shown that there isn't anything special about China leading BRI or Western donors or lenders in terms of how impatient or patient they are as lenders. If you look at the portfolios, you would see horror stories in both, and you would also see occasional enlightened financial cooperation in both. For Africa to make the choice is to make judicious decisions within these options. But if we make the mistake that these represent visions for Africa, we run into deep trouble, because it fails in many ways, not only conceptually, but practically. If you take financial inflows to Africa, it is not official development assistance that is the biggest. It is not foreign direct investment that is the biggest. It is not foreign portfolio investment that is the biggest. It is self-help, diaspora finance that is the biggest. I have the opportunity to be the lead AU consultant on diaspora finance. And the study that I did for them completed a year ago. And the AU Summit of Heads of States have just made a major decision on it on February 6th. I was able to show that instead of what World Bank tells us, that the inflow of remittances to Africa is about 80 billion a year, In fact, it is more like 200 billion for the simple reason that it does not count the ones that come through informal channels. And of course, it does not also count remittances in kind that indeed go into supporting businesses in the forms of equipment, plant, and other things. So you have 200 billion of inflows of diaspora finance that comes, which dwarfs the other forms of investments. There are things that can be done in terms of aggregation, leveraging, and partnering with the self-help finance with other forms of finance, but one must not make the mistake as to where the biggest sums are. And Africa is undercapitalizing and underutilizing this diaspora finance because all of these inflows virtually does not include any significant inflow of the historic African diaspora in North America. In terms of diaspora savings, this is talking about fourth generation migrants outside of Africa. We calculate that that is about 33 billion per year that is sitting in London, New York, and other capital cities outside of Africa. And if a percentage of that was extracted into Africa, into infrastructure and other developmental projects, it would make a difference. And few other comments to mention in terms of what is an ideal mix. All of this foreign financing, there is heavy dependence on debt, and there's a need for the development of equity-based structures. Equity-based structures on ethical basis, which reduces the level of repatriation of funds and increases reinvestment locally and increasing the multiplier effect locally. Other things are operational effectiveness. Sometimes people are excited about the Chinese projects because they offer operational effectiveness. Within a short time, it is done and dusted. You can see it. But of course, you balance that with quality because already in Africa, you have people jokingly talking about this is made in China. Not that China is doing work that's inferior. China is able to do all types of work. BRI shows that it's effectively what you choose. You can choose the best which European companies choose from China and European countries choose, or you can choose inferior ones as well. So it is the decision is on Africa and the African development planners as well. And in addition to operational effectiveness, the last point I would then make is about development impact. To what extent does the investment and development have, as the aspiration of 2063 says, inclusive growth for all? Thank you, and over to you, Shirley.
Thank you so much, Professor Jibril. And let's move on to our last speaker. It happens to be a young policy analyst on Africa, which I'm personally quite fond of. Ovigwe Igwegu is a policy analyst at Development Reimagined. His work focuses on geopolitics and geoeconomics with a particular reference to Africa in the context of a changing global order, which sort of wraps up this whole global geopolitical dynamic with Africa at the center. And before you start, Ovigwe, we are going to move into the Q&A session shortly afterwards. So our audience in the Zoom link today and our audience that are watching us live on Facebook, please feel free to send in your questions. Go ahead, please, Ovigwe.
Yeah, thank you very much for having me. Yeah, can you hear me? Great. Yeah, so Dr. Shelley, thank you for the invitation and special regards and appreciation to the London School of Economics and the Institute for the kind invitation. So from my perspective, looking at BRI, B3W, and all of its promises and all of the things that we hope we can achieve, I think there are certain things or points I would like to start with. First of all, is the fact that the US and the EU taking the initiative on infrastructure or going back into the infrastructure investment business is first an acknowledgement of the fact that China got development in Africa, right, in terms of how it has approached, development. And secondly, I also want to emphasize that from my own experience being here in Nigeria and traveling several African countries discussing this issue, that Africans do care about transparency. They do care about democratic values, which we hear a lot of coming from the US with regards to the B3W. But the issue is those values and those norms, they pale in comparison to the urgency of our infrastructure deficit. Madam Azense just mentioned, the $170 billion a year infrastructure deficit that the African Development Bank projects that Africa will need by 2025. And then if you look at that and look at the fact that by 2050, Africa will be 2.4 billion people. 2050 is not very far away from here. And if you see the inefficiency and the lost productivity caused by lack of infrastructure, whether it's understand that so many countries, especially my country in Nigeria, for instance, they're almost on a race, against time because of what they're trying to get with their economy, and also for reasons of economic growth and stability, and just in some form of having a very decent environment for their citizens. And then another point I also like to mention is the fact that the World Bank, IMF, or multilateral development partner approach is not necessarily perceived as being very effective, especially if you consider the fact that for several years these two institutions, which somewhat represent the Western attitude towards development for many years, they've really been out of touch with reality, not financing infrastructure. I mean, for instance, in our firm Development Reimagine, we made a calculation that shows that since 2002 was the last time the World Bank financed railway in the continent, and there are several countries who have these proposals lined up. They've been sitting down there, but no financing. So it's not effective in those. So the approaches we've seen from these institutions have not been effective, whether on the ground or even by citizens who are observing how they've been their legacy on the continent. So it's not to say that the approach of where they come in to support government with the balancing budget is not important. But I will just give an example. I remember when I was in Kano State. So Kano State is the state in north central Nigeria, where there's a major Chinese financed railway from Lagos, linking to Kano, so the two most populous cities in Nigeria. And we're having this conversation around financing and debt and all of that. At 2020, we had this huge hysteria around debt in Nigeria. And I can remember in that conversation, one man stood up, is a farmer, actually the head of Farmers Association, who are they're very dependent on mobility of their farm produce, said, yeah, it's not as if he's not concerned about debt and all of these issues of sustainability and repayment, but that Nigeria has been borrowing from other institutions like the World Bank as well. But that the one difference in his mind is the fact that he can go outside today and touch exactly what the Nigerian government has done with Chinese financing. He was referring to the railway, but he cannot do that with the World Bank financing or the IMF financing. And that I tell you captures exactly how many people feel, when we're even doing this comparison. So when we go back to when the B3W was announced, I think one of the major issues for me is the framing, and its framing is certainly super hero-like. You're pitching an initiative, but in the same breath you are somewhat painting the alternative, which is Chinese BRI, somewhat as like a bad actor, an actor who does not necessarily mean the interest of African countries. I mean, they might not say it openly, but it's inferred from the statements and the framing that is being used. So that is certainly an issue. And of course, there are geopolitical reasons to be skeptical, about the B3W. So we understand what has happened with with African countries, particularly with the multilateral partners for several years, where some sort of carrot and stick approach is used. And of course, there is this concern that we're hearing this language of values and democracy and rights again. And so they believe that we will see a situation where, just as human rights were used to judge eligibility for certain economic programs and deals, we will see those same attitudes used to judge credibility for infrastructure funding, and that's not going to be very helpful. And I mean, I've said on a few occasions that when you look at the urgency and the stark infrastructure deficit in African countries, people really don't. Not as if people don't care. Like I said, they care, but it just doesn't match their. It's not the priority as it were, like almost like a secondary priority. There are no democratic roads. There are no democratic bridges. Nobody in the continent actually wants. Is looking at a road and saying, yeah, that road is financed by democracy, so I want to drive on that road or I want to use that bridge. The question they're asking and they want their government to answer for them is, can we repay this debt? So what's the debt structure? And then is this road going to contribute to economic productivity? Like, is it connecting, manufacturing hubs and agricultural communities to both domestic and international markets? These are the kind of conversations that Africans want to have, with their government, not the question of whether the road, is democratic or financed by democracy, or not. So again, so that branding is still, a major issue. So if you look at, for instance, with the banding together of G7 countries against against China, it seems cynical, but of course, in their approach to the B3W, it seems that, of course, at the same time, they're offering an alternative, right? So for us, the more the merrier. It's actually good, because we want, as an African or as an African government, if I'm in charge of infrastructure, I want to be able to go out and compare options for whatever infrastructure category that I want to build. So again, I think if we look really closely at both initiatives, the devil really is the details. And in this regard, the B3W is missing key details. For instance, what type of infrastructure might it really focus on? Internet cables? Are you talking about roads, rails, railway, special economic zones? These are very important questions that they're still missing. So, and then which G7 institutions will be involved, and what will be the quantitative metrics that will be used, to judge? Those quantitative metrics are actually missing, such as the volume or even the physical infrastructure goals that we want to achieve. So, and there's also again a question of credibility. And if we look at what China has done domestically in terms of infrastructure development, I mean, as of today, China's high-speed rail accounts for over 65% of the world's total network, of high-speed railway network, and this started building by 2007. So that alone shows that they understand, and it speaks to what Professor Fall recently said, the speed and efficiency which they can use to build. Now, if you contrast that over the same period, let's say going back 40 years, and the relationship between G7 and LICs and even middle-income countries, it's very different. What we've seen, is conversation around rising interest rates, and then there was the debt, 1970s, 80s, social adjustment programs, and the 1990s we had the debt relief. And the 90s to 2000s, and then UN Millennium Development Goals. All of these are important, but again, going back to what my co-panelist here, Azense, said, it's about the priorities for African government, and we've actually put those priorities on paper for everybody, to be able to read. So when China says, for instance, BRI, we focus on infrastructure, we've been seeing infrastructure projects coming up, since 2013. It's easy to believe. Well, in contrast, for where G7 say there will be infrastructure projects coming up, the big question is not of quality, it's whether it will even happen at all, because there are real concerns around that. And then finally, I would say the attitude because if we look at the B3W and how it would be executed, I know it largely will be private sector led, private sector driven. And of course, if we go back and check even the attitude of these organizations, private lenders, when they visit African countries, they don't see opportunity, they see risk, right? And when the development professionals design aid projects, around perpetual agricultural societies, that is not helpful. We want a case where they are using aid and infrastructure to create incentives, for people to shift into manufacturing and services. So it would be great to see that be a major focus. And then again, we cannot ignore the politics of this, because these projects have that impact. And then you look at how even in the interfacing with African government, they also have to change their attitude, towards Africa. So just to conclude, I'll say, if we look at the current situation now, while a shift from BRI versus B3W to a BRI and B3W would be ideal or would be good for Africa, we just cannot ignore the fact that it's not possible because of the geopolitical tension between East and West, particularly China. And then we have to draw on inspiration as African countries from Kwame Nkrumah, when he said, we face neither East nor West, but we must face forward. And forward in this context is Agenda 2063, where Africans have put together exactly what they want to achieve. And we have to recruit partners and partnerships into that vision, rather than take Africa to at least into other people's vision for the world. Thank you.
Thank you, Ovigwe. First of all, just to remind all our audience that are watching us live, please feel free to send in your questions via Facebook or directly in this chat room. So I'm going to start while I have Mr. Danny Russell with us today. It's a precious opportunity to ask. Just now, we just heard Ovigwe saying, oh, well, we don't really mind B3W competing with BRI for Africa. But the point is, we are worried if B3W is going to happen at all. So how long will this prep phase be? And when will the first project be commenced?
Thank you, Shirley. Well, listen, I listen with great interest to a lot of really important and insightful points made by all three speakers, and I'm grateful for that. To Ovigwe's point, it's a very valid concern. The Biden administration, largely for domestic US political reasons, has been quite slow in implementing not only the B3W, formulating it, but also in some of the other priority initiatives that it has spoken of. And this is frustrating, and it does legitimately raise the question of how much delivery there will be and in what time frame, as opposed to a package of promises. That said, I think that, there's no question in my mind that the Biden administration is quite serious about pursuing B3W with a view to harnessing private capital in service of the sort of priority areas of climate, public health, digital technology, gender equity, and so on. And that this is going to be represented in US diplomacy as well as, importantly, in US development strategy. I think also that as part of B3W, the better internal integration of the different actors within the US government is going to take some time, but have really powerful benefits, as is the work of the task force that's been created among the G7 and with others to coordinate and to harmonize efforts in an effort to expand their reach and to increase their impact. Ovigwe pointed out eloquently that roads and bridges aren't democratic, that the issue for Africa is, what can we afford? What are the terms of repayment viable? And how does this project actually connect to real priorities and particularly to prosperity And those are the critical questions. I think that in principle, what B3W aims to do is to ensure that it is the African governments that through increased capacity and through better listening technique are able to make the determinations about those interests. I heard loud and clear and fully understand the concern over framing and this kind of we know better sort of colonial tone. That's very real, and it's clearly something that the US government and other Western governments have got to be very self-aware about and very sensitive to. I think that one point of clarity is that B3W is not Belt and Road with Western characteristics. You know, the US government isn't going to be dispatching construction teams with work gangs from the United States. We don't have state-owned enterprise development companies. It's, as I said, it's a vehicle for mobilizing and catalyzing private sector capital and for facilitating projects that contribute to the stated target values. And we'll see, but the promise, as I said, is that the B3W project countries will have more agency in setting priorities, not just because now there's some competition, but because that approach is very, very different than the Chinese sort of package deal, here's what's on the table approach. I think ideally, and again, I'm not in the US government, I'm not speaking for the US government, but I think that ideally B3W and BRI will coexist, and that the effect of B3W, particularly at a moment when there is greater resistance in developing countries to some aspects of China's BRI tactics, particularly the ones that have generated these, highly problematic outcomes. The white elephant project in Kenya, and so on. The Lamu Power Project, for example, or the Bagamoyo Port Project in Tanzania. So there is both some resistance in that sense, but even more importantly is the issue of the Chinese Treasury. I know many, and I've heard this from my Chinese friends, that generally speaking, that the Chinese middle class is pushing back against the tremendous expense to the national treasury. These BRI projects, let's face it, are not self-sustaining. By and large, they are not generating promised revenues. And many of the loans that China has made, which are state-backed, have proven unrecoverable when a project stalled, sometimes because of the lack of prior project planning. And on top of that, of course, are the fiscal and economic constraints that China is facing in the aftermath of COVID and other global economic factors. Now with the price of oil soaring and the Russia-Ukraine challenge, it looks like it's going to get worse, not better. So China no longer has the kind of unlimited resources to back BRI projects. So in this context, if the net effect of BW3 is to help improve BRI outcomes and lead to some enhancement of the Chinese project preparation to ensure better outcomes, not only will BW3 benefit regions like Africa in its own right, but can have a much more powerful and much more immediate impact if it can cause China to up its own game.
Allow me to follow up on what you have just mentioned, Danny, a couple of times, including your keynote address. that China, one of the key differences between the US development model versus the Chinese development model is the aid and grant programs. And so before 2015, China actually did offer quite a lot of aid programs to Africa. And now in 2018 at the FOCAC meeting, I think China from the state capacity offers something like $60 billion to African countries over 3 years. And that was almost the zenith. And in 2021, we started to see President Xi Jinping rediverted the private sector to take a leadership in Africa's investment. And he pledged $10 billion investment in over 3 years' time solely by the private sector. So we started to see exactly incisively, as you pointed out, that the state-led development model perhaps is also unsustainable for China, but we started to see this transformation towards the private sector. So do you see from your the entire expertise on China's BRI, is this 2021's pivot to the private sector to lead in Africa's development an irreversible pivot? Does that represent an irreversible retrenchment from the Chinese government?
I mean, to be honest, Shirley, I think it reflects wishful thinking on the part of the Chinese leadership. First of all, there's been a very substantial disparity between the promises made in the context of BRI and the reality, the delivery. And that is true not merely in the sense that Xi Jinping has promised, high standards of transparency, anti-corruption, environmental sustainability, fiscal sustainability, et cetera. And there's very little on the ground to bear that out. But also simply the rate of delivery in terms of Chinese government's promises of assistance, whether it's BRI or other forms of development. My focus is on East Asia. I know a bit about East Asia. I know relatively little about Africa, I'm afraid. But for example, an Indonesian government institution made an assessment where they concluded that something on the order of only 11% of the promised investment and deals made by China, by President Xi Jinping to President Jokowi, beginning in 2013 and 2014, only 11% had been delivered after the first 5 or 6 years. So I don't know how that equates to the experience in Africa, but the point is that there's a lot of talk, and that's true, honestly, for all governments. But we shouldn't overlook it. Secondly, maybe more importantly, is that you simply don't see private companies, including private Chinese companies and private Chinese entrepreneurs, following the leadership call to invest in Belt and Road projects. It's not happening. You do see private Chinese developers trying to tap into the China Development Bank or the policy bank's financing. You do see them advancing BRI projects, but they do so to make their money, to make their profit, and then move on. You don't see private investment in China, and you certainly don't see investment from outside China, other than from the countries that are hosting the projects, being invested, because the projects simply are not constructed in a manner that private investors believe is going to be safe or is going to yield a profit. The sort of catch-22 here, or at least the potential for a virtuous cycle, is that if the Chinese government took the measures necessary and enforced some of the great rules and laws that they actually have on the books to ensure that projects were designed in a solid and a responsible way, then you would start to see foreign investors and commercial banks looking at it. And the more that such sources of funding were involved, the more private capital was invested, the greater the pressure there would be for due diligence and transparency and so on. But right now, even the Chinese created Asian Infrastructure Investment Bank, AIIB, has very, very, very few investments in BRI. And the ones that they do seem really to be kind of politically motivated. These are not truly bankable projects. And to the extent that B3W helps to move BRI projects in the direction of financial and environmental sustainability, that would be a great outcome.
So, and that's where you are in Kenya. China just completed the largest solar energy project in the African continent. So China indeed on the ground is investing in renewable energy. And as a matter of fact, China has been the global leader in investment in renewable energy for a number of years now. Do you see where should the G7 step in? How active are the G7 countries in developing this environmental transformation and the sustainability in Africa? And that's perhaps for all of our three African experts.
I think I'll just start by dealing with some of the issues that have come out of this conversation. I think, first of all, whether it's the Chinese government or B3W, they're interfacing with the African governments. So what they're doing is that they're interfacing with the political economy of technocracy in Africa. Yeah. So sometimes defaulting to blaming China or defaulting to blaming the World Bank or defaulting to blaming others actually absolves African governments from their responsibility. So in my experience, the 5 elements of that political economy of technocracy is first capacity. The second is commitment. The other one is corruption, because I think that one tends to be labored, very, very deeply. The other big one is coordination, and frankly, there's competition. So people have these conversations like they're not vested interests in African governments. The biggest problems that we have as African people is that vested interests preponderate. Vested interests are prioritized over what Africans feel are ambitions. Therefore, is it the responsibility of the BRI or B3W to deal with that? Is it for them to deal with that? Or is it at some point, as we say, we're the ones to actually figure out this political economy of technocracy? Now, this will be a journey because Africa is young in 3 ways. We're young demographically, we're young politically, and we're young economically. So these false comparisons between Africa and countries that have been around for 300 years is just nonsense, particularly given the fact that we've gone through, especially after independence, the Cold War was a period of such deep instability. And frankly, the practices of then the USSR and the Washington Consensus actually delegitimized democracy in Africa. And we created this cult of a leadership culture that we see in Africa that's been the bane of the existence of many African people. So I think we really need to be aware that at some point, the supply-driven narrative will hit the reality that it is then African governments who integrate their vested interests into whatever deal. This will be the Achilles heel of B3W. Going on about the corruption and all of these issues. How are you going to be having that tone with a government that needs to pay you in 10 to 15 years? How are you going to be having that tone when those vested interests, that is an expectation? And so that's why, when Obigwe is talking about these things, these are the practical things that we see. And sometimes that vested interest can be made to look like a lack of capacity. Yeah, that vested interest can be made to look like a lack of coordination. And that's why I'm saying the infantilization of African governments actually allows a lot of problematic things to go on because people are not looking at the type of intelligence that's being deployed positively and problematically on the continent by African governments. So I'm just going to say that because there seems to be this view that somehow if values change elsewhere, somehow that changes things in Africa. But in reality, this is an old struggle that African people have been dealing with since the Cold War. I think on the point of the energy, it's very interesting. You know, when you're looking at the private sector role in BRI, I don't know if that's the vision the Chinese government has. If you're looking from an African perspective, what we're seeing is that the appetite and the performance of Chinese investment in Africa has been spectacular. It has outstripped and outdone what the US and Europe have done. And I'm writing a piece on this that will come out a bit later. But just to be clear, since 2000, Chinese direct investment in Africa has increased by more than 25% per annum. China was the largest investor in Africa by jobs between 2017 and 2022. And you have to bear in mind that these feats are being done with language barriers, with cultural barriers, and all these other things. Of course, we've got a deep problematic element, particularly on the ESG side, that Africans have been quite vocal about and rightly about. But I think this idea that the Chinese state only wants private investment to be directed to BRI is actually not true. Because if you look at even the criteria that we're seeing that Chinese private sector is applying when they're deciding where to invest in Africa, they're looking at latent issues that are already there: the demography, the size of the economy, market capabilities. What does the private sector look like in there? What are the opportunities? How do we use Africa to access other markets? They're being very pragmatic about it, and therefore they're being able to tap into a lot more opportunity than any sort of state-led directive. And I think just finally on the values point, because I think Ovigwe does highlight an issue. From a private sector, even the Chinese private sector, I think, will continue to outperform Europe and North America because they do not look at things like the governance structure of an African economy to decide whether they're going to actually make that investment. Whereas the global north and global north investors often look at things like, you know, property rights, the rule of law. What we're seeing is this Chinese investments are looking at political stability and market opportunity, right? So for African countries that have been blacklisted by the West, of which there are many, yeah, because sometimes how you're blacklisted is not clear, but you end up being blacklisted, right? So for those countries, what happens is that that opportunity is alive for not only the Chinese government, but the Chinese private sector as well. So I think it's very important to center the reality that all these initiatives, whether from China, from North America, from Europe, they're going to end up dealing with Africans. And we will be using whatever matrices we have and whatever criteria we have, positive or negative, to then filter those opportunities to meet whatever objective it is that we want, whether it's a government, as a private sector, or civil society. So I think is something that needs to be more alive, I think, in conversations.
So on the ground, it's really interesting. Also, I could attest that 90% of current Chinese FDI in Africa, in terms of the numbers of companies, 90% of them are actually Chinese private companies. So it's absolutely a vibrant scene there. But let me bring another very exciting subject, and I'm going to pick this question from our chat box. From our audience, it says he or she is particularly interested in the technological trends in Africa, particularly with AI. How does the two, possibly both the BRI and the B3W, are going to contribute to Africa's AI development? And now, particularly given China's larger ambition to be a global AI superpower, just like the United States.
Is that for me? I could take that.
Please.
Okay. No, I mean, as I said, and we had a whole session on this last year, is that if you're looking at the foundational infrastructure that has allowed the African digital revolution to happen, Chinese private and public capital has been instrumental. I mean, there is no questions about that. Of course, there are concerns about dependency, you know, and that's where particularly the Europe and North America come in particularly far away. But if you're looking at the actual infrastructure, hard and increasingly soft, that is allowing African private sector to build solutions onto that, it's been instrumental, you know. And I think that is a sort of appreciation that I think needs to be, that I think Ovigwe was making, is that it doesn't matter so much who did it, is that if you meet a priority of the African government and you're able to then allow the African private sector to step in and use it, I think that's the way. But if you look at the tech stack, I mean, obviously we've been evolving, you know, if you're looking at technology, and I work in fintech, so I understand this a bit. But if you're looking at from, you know, what is the cables and the hardware, what we're seeing, interestingly, that I think is quite exciting, is that the Chinese are playing both on the hardware and the software side. So if you're looking at African access to the internet, that is Chinese smartphones. Yeah. So even as the Europe and North America bang on about rule of law, sometimes the only way they're getting that information is because of a China-funded smartphone and China-funded cable that is then beaming all that information that they can get access to. These are the ironies that are really emerging. So what we're seeing is this evolution from a very hardware focus to the lot more software applications, whether it's fintech or sector-specific tech that we're seeing. Obviously, Safaricom, Huawei is an anchor partner. This is the largest mobile money network in the world. And so that's the sort of view we see in Africa is what skills and capabilities do these different players bring to the ambitions and visions that we have as Africans. But it will be a very dynamic space going forward, I think.
Anybody else? Professor Fall or Weekly? Any thoughts?
Yeah, so for me, with regards to the question around digital economy and digitalization, I think it's quite for me. See, if there's one area where I think whether Global Gateway or B3 or B3W really has an advantage, I would say is the digital infrastructure, right? Because it's the one infrastructure category where you can make the argument for values. Because I said there are no democratic roads, there are no democratic bridges, right? But there's something called a free and open internet, right? There's an internet. There are principles that soft principles that guide digital infrastructure. Now, where I begin to sort of deviate from Western attitude or US and European attitude towards digital infrastructure is what really constitutes a democratic, internet. Because on the one hand, what we hear from the US is, yes, we want to build a digital infrastructure, or the European Union with the Global Gateway now want to build a digital internet we build on our own systems, like on our own servers and whatever, domiciled maybe in Europe or in the US, as opposed to China, for instance, that comes in. Look at what with Camtel in Cameroon, where you build state-of-the-art modern quality infrastructure. Their data centers also. We're looking at Senegal, the same thing. So where there is emphasis on digital sovereignty. Now, digital sovereignty and the question of sovereignty can be democratic, because if you cannot trust a government with the data of its own people, then you can as well not have a government, because we're referring to data as the new oil. So African government wanting to have digital sovereignty, it's not necessarily to strong arm opposition. It is part of our democratic dividend to be able to control our data. The people elected the government, let that government control their data. So we have to, going forward, we have to balance whether we want to define a democratic internet along the lines of just having a space where any journalist or anybody can say whatever they like and nobody get prosecuted, versus whether we want to have a democratic internet where the definition really pay due diligence, regard to data digital sovereignty.
Of course. Professor Fall, anything to add?
Well, and
then I'm going back to Danny. Yep, please.
Yes, just a couple of observations. So the fourth industrial revolution is supposed to be a sort of equalizer that can help sort of low starters do a technology leap. If you look at Africa, for a long time, I think even today, Kenya and to a greater extent Somalia are the world leaders in mobile money. And to a great extent, that was purely an African innovation. With all of this discourse I'm hearing about BRI and B3W, my main argument is that we in Africa, we are elevating it as a discussion of vision, and that's fundamentally wrong. It should be at the level of options and opportunities. The vision must remain African. And if you apply that to technology, you could see, although the base we're starting it is relatively low, but the examples that this is a better way to development are very eloquent, with mobile money as an example. If you take some of the major investment in the infrastructure around mobile money, you don't see these big G7 or big China contribution. Mobile money in Africa was started by Celtel. It was an African diaspora person with private equity money and some ODA that started it when everybody doubted it. If you take the forced laying of under ocean cables linking West Africa to Europe, it was done by a Nigerian finance company. That was the first investment of the Africa Finance Corporation. So in all of this talk, we have almost marginalized the major financing institutions in Africa, which in my view need to be strengthened if these big external development partners are coming in. They shouldn't do it to the expense of the development institutions here. Of course, for the African players, it gives them more choice, but it needs to be balanced in a way, especially when it comes to public policy, that the mushrooming of development finance institutions, the growth in commercial banks and development and investment banks, and of course of the African multilateral finance institutions need to be stronger so that we have a choice as to who to go to continentally rather than just these external institutions. Thank you.
Right. So Danny, really interesting. Gibral just talked about Africa's indigenous entrepreneurship, which is truly vibrant as well. Now, Anzetsa earlier brought the fact that Chinese private technology companies, particularly if we look at a case of Huawei, that are building submarine cable networks all across both coasts of Africa, providing fast speed, low-cost internet access to Africa continent, almost at the same cost and value to in Southern Europe today. And we're looking at 7 possibly out of 10 smartphones in Africa made by Chinese companies. And more importantly, Anzetsa talked about the soft element of technology. So for example, the first public cloud in Africa is built again by Huawei. So we are proud of, in the United States and in the UK, we're proud of our private companies. Where are the Facebooks and the Amazons of the world? Do you think particularly in ASEAN, we're facing the same issues? Where are our companies competing there?
Well, great question, Shirley. And I don't know the answer other than in the infamous words of the Watergate scandal, follow the money. These are entirely private and not state-directed corporations. They're immense in their scope, and they make their own calculations about profit, investment, allocation of resources, et cetera. But I think it's certainly important to recognize the degree to which Chinese companies, the state-directed, state-owned enterprises as part of Chinese national strategies, but also Chinese private entrepreneurs, I'm sorry to say, that are coming increasingly under immense regulatory and ideological pressure at home in China right now, and they wind up having their wings clipped. But nevertheless, these private entrepreneurs, particularly in the digital payment space and in commercial communications technology and so on, have been phenomenally successful and provided real value. So I mean, all 3 of the speakers make very, very good and very relevant, important points, and I'm carefully taking notes. To Anetse's questions and observations, looking at the B3W, looking at the digital Silk Road, we don't know yet. To what extent will the B3W present really a viable alternative to the functions embedded in the digital Silk Road, the technology investments and so on? Or to what extent will the B3W have the effect of assisting African decision makers, actors themselves to recognize and to shield against the problematic aspects of what China is offering. In other words, to be able to accept and exploit Chinese technology while screening out what they judge to be certain pernicious or undesirable aspects of it. Maybe African countries don't want China to be able to extract unlimited quantities of data, sort of in a colonial sort of harvesting of resources manner. Maybe African decision makers can take measures to prevent against the technology lock-in effect, where they gradually become dependent and have fewer options, not more. Maybe civil society can push back against some of the censorship or other facilities that are built into Chinese technology. And I think this ties into Ovigwe's important point about digital sovereignty. You know, governments and societies make choices about how to use the technology. And sort of just vilifying Chinese products, Chinese technology is, to my mind, a mistake, and is certainly not a pathway to any kind of solution. As the speakers have pointed out, you know, China has contributed, you know, a massive amount, absolutely the lion's share of both hardware and software to Africa. Look, I think, lastly, to Professor Fall's point, the example of e-finance really does underscore the importance of focusing on options and opportunities of promoting, fostering, facilitating indigenous entrepreneurship. I like to think that the United States has a history of facilitating and exporting new forms of entrepreneurship. Certainly in the Obama administration, that was a top priority. The last 5 years have been perhaps a little wobbly in some respects in terms of US international outreach, but this is an area where I think the US government can, should, and really must maintain a high degree of emphasis.
We have very limited time left. I just wanted to hit on one quite sensitive point, that is China's defense strategies with African countries. And so in the past 2 rounds of FOCAC meetings, China has talked about naming essentially defense or mutual defense between China and Africa as a top priority in China's FOCAC vision. And so recently we have seen a WSJ report that in Equatorial Guinea, essentially the US senior staff members from the national security team has warned the country not to allow China to build a deep water military port, because the biggest fear is to have the Chinese military presence that's basically 6 hours away from the Gulf of Mexico across the Atlantic. So when China talked about China and Africa are going to mutually watch out for each other against whom? Does the US have, instead of a reactive response each time with China's investment in Africa, does the US have a proactive defense strategy when it comes to a pivotal region that's not only transforming economically, but also comprehensively?
Shirley, can I guess say you're asking me that
Please.
question? Although
Yes,
I don't
absolutely.
want to, I've spoken a lot, I don't want to speak too much. The Chinese have adopted a principle and now a law called civil military fusion, which not just blurs the distinction, but requires all civilian Chinese companies, all civilian infrastructure to be responsive and subordinate to Chinese military equities and interests. So as a result, the ports that my team has examined in South Asia and East Asia as examples revealed that all overseas port construction by Chinese companies, private or state-owned, must adhere to the construction standards of the PLA, basically China's Navy. That means that regardless of the purpose of a port, its commercial nature, it has to be constructed in a way that will meet the size requirements and the clearance requirements of Chinese warships. In addition, the ports in other aspects we see are being built to a dual use standard. So they can start as purely commercial ports and evolve to be logistics hubs, and could in principle serve as defense stations for Chinese Navy. Look, those direct fears of Chinese Navy dominating the waters off Africa, et cetera, those are very, very far away. And there's a certain amount of hysteria, a certain amount of scaremongering that attaches to the risk that China is building ports. I think it's fair to point out the extent to which these are not entirely innocent enterprises, and the Chinese rhetoric and narrative about what they are, it's all about world peace and win-win outcomes, doesn't necessarily track with some of the concrete realities of how they're being constructed and what they're capable of. But no cause for panic, certainly. The key question here is, what is it that China is defending or purports to defend? And what is it that the United States has been defending? What's the track record of the United States over the past 6 or 7 decades? There is a whole lot to fault in the behavior of the United States militarily and of the US military in particular, including on the African continent. But I continue to believe that it's fair to say that the United States is committed to defending international law, international norms, principles such as the freedom of the seas and of airspace, the right of all countries to access these global commons, and that a strategy of denial, which is what we see China pursuing in its own peripheral waters. In other words, trying to keep out foreign navies from international waters and trying to restrict access such that China is the arbiter of who, whether a military or civilian aircraft or Navy ship, can enter international waters, that this has the potential to expand globally. There is absolutely nothing wrong with a sovereign country like China having a global navy. The United States has one. China has equal rights to it. There is, though, a question of what is it that China is seeking to accomplish and what is it that it's seeking to defend, and how does that contrast with the record of the United States?
We unfortunately have run out of time, but I would love to invite our distinguished speakers to have a quick wrap up of today's session with also 2 questions in mind, 2 short questions from our chat rooms. One is about the BRI's investment. Is it unilateral in Africa? And I guess the question is, Africa is not a whole. So essentially, when Danny talked about China-Africa relationship is bilateral, it's actually not bilateral. It's many, many mini bilateral relationships in there. Are there any internal competitions within Africa? And another question is, going forward, what are some of the key challenges for African countries when it comes to receiving Chinese investments? And I would welcome all our speakers to please give a closing concluding remark. And maybe we start with Professor Fall.
Thank you very much, Shirley, and thank you to all of the speakers and the question. Africa's political history means that it is still vulnerable to being used, abused, and exploited. That is the fact. So the biggest challenge is its judicious choices given the geopolitical and economic circumstances in the world. And I think its biggest opportunity is not being focused on the external opportunities dangled in front of it, but to examine itself and tease out the successes it has made for itself. And in this discussion relating to development finance, there are examples of it, of African-grown institutions. Right now, commercial banking has gone continental with very dynamic Nigerian banks operating everywhere, to the extent that the dynamic banks from Kenya are seeking to compete. In terms of innovations, we've seen African entrepreneurs in technology and other areas, starting from almost an impossible start and making huge differences. So the challenge to policymakers is to focus on building on these positives of self-help, because be it China on BRI or G7, why are we having this discussion? Because they've had the means to be in a controlling position, and Africa is talking as a beneficiary. We need to sift and get out of that, and we can only do that through self-help and policies that build on self-help. Thank you.
Ovikwi, please.
Yeah. So for me, I think, I completely agree with Professor Fowles' point, because we have to really look inwards, and the initiative, it's clear that that's an initiative we need to take. And like I said earlier, when you look at what we have achieved with the AFCFTA, with all of the other components of the Agenda 2063, we have our own vision. We have our own agenda we set forth for ourselves. It's a question of how and who do we recruit into the process to support our own initiatives and our own plans for ourselves, as opposed to marketing Africa as a partner to or as a worthy recipient of someone's own vision or development program. So while we do of course have to take into cognizance the fact that I think it was Dambisa Moyo that mentioned that I wrote a book about dead aid. One of the major thing we have to take into factor into our relationship with the US and European partners is we need to go from to ODA to actual investment, like overseas investment, I say ODI, official direct investment. We need them to make that shift, because we are at a point where the continent is in full flux, and what is really needed, whether it's in the private sector, all the public sector and PPPs. PPPs, like Azenti mentioned, is the future. Even China is looking towards it. The US, of course, has been big on private sector led, but you cannot do without making that shift, because the 10 billion which distinguished Daniel Russell mentioned, that 10 billion of ODA, if put directly into, if you morph that into, for instance, investment into more infrastructure, even if it's just 60% of that, I can guarantee you that the US will make far more progress than just focusing on aid, because we've seen over and over again that is not a very judicious way to support the continent. And for the Chinese side, I think one of the main issues that we need to be very cautious of is to try to really, make a very clear understanding of what exactly is, a really constructed for our interests, and where do we really need to, where exactly can we find, more Africa's exports to China, because that is really very crucial for our own development as well, and economies, because that is going to be very essential given China's growing and very import hungry market. Thank you.
Exports and FDI. And Zeta, please.
Thank you. I just have to say thank you to all the panelists, and thank you, Shirley and the LSC. I think at the end of the day, Africa, like everybody else, has multiple centers of agency. That agency is constructive and destructive. That agency is not necessarily coordinated. So really what we're dealing with, and Africa often is the nexus, because often as the continent in the world that has the least power economically and politically so far, what ends up happening is we end up being the nexus of how that plays out. And I think it's going to be a journey, particularly for African governments and African peoples, to start getting an ideological sense of how we want to express that agency, and the practical reality that any agency ends up interfacing with vested interest. And so really Africa shows that it's an ideological battle at the end of the day. And if people do not come with a sense of united self-interest, and I think I say this to B3W, I say to the China, I say that to anyone, if you do not come with enlightened self-interest when interacting with Africa, you're going to get the same immaturity from the African side, and you'll attract that same level of low-level immature relating, whether it's economically, politically, etc. So I think this is a real opportunity for Africa, for us to not only emancipate ourselves from mental slavery, but I think it's time for the world to emancipate themselves from colonial mentalities, free themselves from slave master mentalities, so that we're really having a bit of an enlightened conversation to get to a lot of these gnarly issues. Thank you.
Danny.
Well, I've listened with great interest and humility to the speakers from Africa. I've learned a lot. My own view is that Africa and Africans can provide the vision and the agenda. That doesn't have to be dropped on them by outside powers. And we all know that treating Africa as a battlefield for geostrategic rivalry is a strategy that's going to damage everybody's interests. Cannot be successful. The Build Back Better World construct is very nascent. It's something of an organizing principle for the US agencies themselves and for their donor partners. Creating good options, creating a virtuous cycle that will help drive all the parties, Chinese, Western, African, to up their game, to follow, as I said, enlightened self-interest is what I devoutly hope the B3W will grow into. Thank you.
With that, thank you so much for our audience from around the world, and particularly people who have zoomed in with us to stay with us for 10 minutes over. On behalf of the Firoz Lalji Institute for Africa at the London School of Economics, we thank all our speakers today, and we thank you for your attention. Have a nice day.